Welcome to Historical Legacies. Here, we dive into history's most intriguing stories, unraveling mysteries and uncovering truths from the past. Subscribe to join our journey through time's greatest moments. Beyond the Sand, True Story of Lawrence of Arabia. An introduction. The name Lawrence of Arabia conjures images of a lone figure draped in flowing robes, riding across the vast desert, a bridge between two worlds. But behind the legend was a man, T. Lawrence, a scholar, a soldier, and a strategist who reshaped history. His role in the Arab Revolt during World War I made him a hero to some and a mystery to others. Was he a liberator, a manipulator, or simply a man caught between duty and ambition? Born in Wales and educated at Oxford, Lawrence was never destined for an ordinary life. His fascination with the Middle East led him into the heart of a war that would define him. As an intelligence officer, he defied convention, leading daring guerrilla campaigns alongside Arab forces against the Ottoman Empire. He fought not just with weapons but with ideas, uniting tribes under a single cause. But war was never simple, and neither was Lawrence. This documentary peels away the myth to reveal the truth, his victories, his struggles, and the cost of his legacy. From the deserts of Arabia to the political betrayals that followed, his journey is one of brilliance, sacrifice, and controversy. This is the real story of Lawrence of Arabia. Part 1: A Scholar's Path, the making of T. Lawrence. The journey of T. Lawrence did not begin in the deserts of Arabia, but in the quiet landscapes of Wales, where he was born in 1888. His childhood was marked by an unconventional upbringing. His parents, who never legally married, raised him in an environment that valued intellect and independence. From a young age, Lawrence exhibited an intense fascination with history, particularly medieval warfare and the great empires of the past. This passion shaped his path, guiding him toward an academic life that would later transform into something far greater. His brilliance led him to Oxford, where he immersed himself in medieval history, but it was his fascination with the Middle East that set him apart. While studying, he embarked on long journeys through France and the Levant, cycling across vast distances to examine the remnants of Crusader castles. These experiences deepened his interest in Arab history and warfare, forging a connection with a world vastly different from his own. His academic research focused on the architecture and military strategies of medieval fortresses, unknowingly preparing him for the guerrilla warfare he would later master. His love for ancient civilizations took him beyond the confines of academia and into the heart of the Middle East. He joined an archaeological expedition in Syria and Mesopotamia, working under renowned scholars who sought to uncover lost histories. During these years, he not only studied ancient ruins, but also immersed himself in the culture, learning Arabic fluently and building relationships with local tribes. Unlike many Westerners of his time, Lawrence sought to understand rather than impose, an approach that earned him the trust of those around him. His ability to adapt to foreign customs, combined with his sharp intellect, made him an invaluable observer of the region. Yet, archaeology was not his only pursuit. Behind the veil of academic exploration, Lawrence's work served another purpose: intelligence gathering for the British government. His travels provided crucial insights into the political landscape of the Ottoman-controlled territories, making him an asset to British officials seeking to navigate the complex web of tribal alliances. He mapped strategic locations, studied local power structures, and became increasingly aware of the tensions simmering beneath the surface. Unbeknownst to him, these skills would soon thrust him into the heart of a revolution. His family background also played a role in shaping his worldview. As the son of an aristocratic father who had abandoned his title, and an Irish mother with a strong moral compass, Lawrence grew up with a sense of being caught between two worlds. This internal conflict mirrored his later struggles in the Middle East, where he would find himself torn between loyalty to Britain and his commitment to the Arab cause. He was a man driven by ideals but also burdened by the weight of duty, a contradiction that would define his future. Even before war broke out, Lawrence had begun forming connections with influential figures in the Middle East. His time among Arab communities introduced him to leaders who would later become instrumental in the Arab Revolt. He earned their respect not through force but through understanding, proving himself as more than just a foreign academic. His linguistic skills, combined with his ability to navigate both British and Arab spheres, placed him in a unique position, one that would soon make him indispensable to the unfolding conflict. But this journey was not without challenges. As a young foreigner, gaining acceptance in a land shaped by deep-rooted traditions was no easy task. He had to prove himself time and time again, not only through his knowledge, but also through his actions. He learned to survive in the harsh desert climate, adapting to customs that were entirely foreign to him. These experiences hardened him, preparing him for the trials that lay ahead. By the time World War I erupted, Lawrence was no longer just a scholar or an archaeologist. He had become something more, a man whose understanding of history, culture, and strategy made him uniquely suited for the chaos to come. The boy who had once studied Crusader castles would soon lead an army through the deserts of Arabia, shaping history in ways he had never imagined. Part 2: The Road to the Desert, Lawrence and the Middle East. When war erupted in 1914, Lawrence found himself drawn into a conflict far greater than he had ever imagined. His deep knowledge of the Middle East, gained through years of archaeological study and intelligence gathering, made him an asset to the British war effort. He was recruited by British military intelligence and assigned to the newly formed Arab Bureau in Cairo, a secretive organization dedicated to understanding and manipulating Middle Eastern affairs. From behind a desk, Lawrence analyzed maps, studied tribal structures, and intercepted enemy communications, providing crucial insights into Ottoman-controlled territories. But paperwork and bureaucracy never suited him. He was not content to be an observer. He wanted to be in the field where history was unfolding. At the Arab Bureau, Lawrence quickly distinguished himself. Unlike many British officers, who viewed the region through the lens of colonial ambition, he approached it with deep respect and understanding. His ability to speak Arabic fluently, combined with his knowledge of tribal politics, allowed him to navigate the complex web of alliances that defined the region. He studied Ottoman defenses, tracked enemy troop movements, and interpreted intercepted messages, offering a strategic advantage to the British military. Yet the more he learned, the more he grew frustrated with British policies. The promises made to the Arabs, particularly those from the Sharif of Mecca, felt hollow, and Lawrence began questioning the true motives of the empire he served. His first major encounter with Arab leaders came through the negotiations between Britain and Sharif Hussein of Mecca, who sought independence for the Arab people in exchange for rising against the Ottoman Empire. Lawrence observed as Britain's diplomats made vague assurances, promising Arab autonomy, while secretly negotiating with France over the future partition of the region. He sensed the growing mistrust between Arab leaders and the British, and he realized that words alone would not be enough to secure an alliance. It was during these meetings that he first encountered Prince Faisal, the son of Sharif Hussein. Unlike many Arab leaders, Faisal was pragmatic, charismatic, and driven by the vision of a united Arab state. Lawrence saw in him a leader who could rally the tribes, and in return, Faisal saw in Lawrence a Western officer who actually understood their struggle. Despite his growing role in intelligence and diplomacy, Lawrence felt confined in Cairo. He had spent too much time analyzing battle plans from a distance. He wanted to see the war firsthand. His reports to British command warned that simply arming Arab rebels would not be enough. The tribes needed a leader who could unite them against the Ottomans, and Lawrence believed he could help fill that role. But convincing his superiors was not easy. The British military saw him as an academic, not a soldier, and they were reluctant to send an untrained officer deep into hostile territory. However, Lawrence persisted, arguing that his knowledge of the region and relationships with local leaders made him uniquely suited for the task. Eventually, his request was granted. He was sent on a mission to assess the strength of the Arab Revolt, a seemingly simple task that would change the course of his life. His journey into the desert marked the beginning of his transformation, from a scholar of history to a man shaping it. As he left the familiar confines of Cairo and stepped onto the burning sands of Arabia, he knew there was no turning back. He was no longer just an observer. He was now part of the struggle. Part 3. War begins. The Arab Revolt and a man caught in it. In June 1916, the Arabian Peninsula erupted in rebellion. Sharif Hussein of Mecca, with the backing of the British, declared war against the Ottoman Empire, igniting what would come to be known as the Arab Revolt. His sons, including Prince Faisal, led the charge, rallying tribes across the region to rise up against Ottoman rule. But what began as a call for freedom soon met the harsh reality of war. The Ottomans, battle-hardened and heavily armed, had no intention of relinquishing control. Arab forces faced immediate setbacks, struggling to unify against a common enemy, while navigating internal rivalries that threatened to collapse the revolt before it could gain momentum. Into this fragile alliance stepped T. Lawrence. Dispatched as a British liaison officer, he left Cairo behind and ventured deep into the desert, eager to witness the rebellion firsthand. His mission was straightforward: assess the strength of the revolt and determine whether Britain should continue supporting it. But Lawrence quickly realized this was no simple task. The tribes were divided, each with its own loyalties and ambitions, and the Ottomans remained a formidable force. If the revolt was to succeed, it needed strategy, unity, and leadership. Lawrence saw potential in Faisal, but Faisal in turn was wary of Lawrence. Faisal tested Lawrence before placing his trust in him. Unlike other British officers, Lawrence arrived without an air of superiority. He dressed in local attire, spoke Arabic fluently, and demonstrated a deep understanding of the region's history. But that alone was not enough. Faisal had encountered many Westerners who made promises, but failed to deliver. He wanted to see if Lawrence was merely an observer, or someone willing to risk his life for the cause. As Ottoman forces pressed forward, Lawrence accompanied Faisal's men into battle, experiencing war in the desert for the first time. It was nothing like the battles of Europe. There were no clear front lines, no trenches, no uniformed armies marching in formation. Instead, there was chaos, raids under the scorching sun, ambushes in the dead of night, and blood staining the shifting sands. Lawrence's first encounter with combat was brutal. He witnessed the sheer ferocity of the Ottoman army, whose soldiers fought with the ruthless efficiency of an empire determined to crush rebellion. Arab fighters, many of whom had never experienced organized warfare, struggled against well-trained Ottoman battalions. In the aftermath of his first skirmish, Lawrence walked among the dead and wounded, his romantic notions of war shattered. He had studied conflict in books, analyzed it from the safety of intelligence offices, but nothing had prepared him for the raw violence of battle. Despite these early losses, the tide began to shift. Lawrence, now fully immersed in the struggle, devised strategies that played to the strengths of the Arab fighters. Instead of engaging in conventional battles, they turned to guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, and sabotage. Ottoman supply lines were disrupted, communication routes severed, and isolated garrisons overrun. One of the first major victories came at Rabeg, a strategic outpost on the western coast. Lawrence helped coordinate the assault, demonstrating that unconventional tactics could defeat a numerically superior enemy. This success earned him Faisal's trust and cemented his place within the revolt. Yet, as Lawrence fought alongside the Arabs, a deeper conflict took root within him. He was still a British officer, and he knew Britain's true intentions were not as noble as they appeared. Behind the promises of Arab independence lurked secret agreements, most notably the Sykes-Picot Agreement, that aimed to divide the region between Britain and France once the Ottomans were defeated. Each victory he helped secure brought the Arabs closer to a dream that he feared Britain would never allow them to realize. He had become more than just an ally to the revolt. He had become a man caught between loyalties, fighting a war that was not entirely his, for a cause that Britain might ultimately betray. Part 4. Guerrilla Warfare, Strategy, Deception and Desert Tactics. As the Arab Revolt pressed forward, Lawrence abandoned conventional warfare, fully committing to the unpredictable and brutal art of guerrilla tactics. Traditional battles against the Ottomans had proven costly and ineffective, forcing Lawrence and his Bedouin allies to rethink their approach. They could not match the Ottoman forces in sheer numbers or firepower, but they had one crucial advantage: the desert itself. The vast, unforgiving landscape became both their weapon and their shield, allowing them to strike suddenly and vanish into the sands before retaliation could come. Lawrence's strategy relied on speed, deception, and unpredictability. Mobility was the key: long marches across treacherous terrain, launching swift and devastating attacks on enemy outposts, and then disappearing into the dunes before a counterattack could be organized. He understood that to truly weaken the Ottomans, he had to sever their supply lines and disrupt their infrastructure. His first major target was the Hejaz Railway, a vital lifeline connecting Ottoman forces across Arabia. Using carefully planted explosives, Lawrence and his men destroyed key sections of the railway, derailing trains and forcing the enemy to divert resources toward repairs instead of combat. Each explosion sent shockwaves through Ottoman ranks, proving that the Arab forces were an ever-present threat, even deep within enemy-controlled territory. But physical sabotage alone was not enough. Lawrence turned to psychological warfare, instilling fear and uncertainty into Ottoman soldiers. He spread misinformation, misleading enemy scouts and spies with false intelligence. He used disguises and deception, often appearing in unexpected places to create the illusion of a much larger force. Some Ottoman commanders hesitated to advance, unsure of where or when an attack would come. This uncertainty weakened morale, causing some soldiers to abandon their posts and others to fall into paranoia, believing they were being watched at all times. Mastering the desert was as important as mastering the enemy. Lawrence adapted to the harsh environment, relying on Bedouin knowledge to survive in one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. Water was scarce, the sun merciless, and the nights freezing. Yet, his forces learned to move swiftly and endure long treks without food or water, giving them an advantage over the more heavily supplied, but less mobile Ottoman troops. Lawrence himself embraced the Bedouin way of life, adopting their clothing, customs, and survival skills, further blending into the rebellion. His ability to move seamlessly between cultures made him not just a military leader, but a symbol of unity among the divided Arab tribes. The attacks continued, growing in scale and ambition. A daring raid on a heavily fortified Ottoman outpost left the enemy reeling, proving that guerrilla tactics could break even the strongest defenses. In response, the Ottomans reinforced their security, sending out patrols to hunt down Lawrence and his men. They deployed their own spies, hoping to infiltrate and disrupt Arab operations. This forced Lawrence to refine his strategies, ensuring that every move was calculated, every risk measured. The game of deception became deadlier, and each raid carried higher stakes. But with every victory, the cost of war became heavier. Lawrence was no longer just an observer. He was a warrior, leading missions himself and putting his life on the line. He witnessed firsthand the horrors of battle, the suffering of captured allies, and the relentless brutality of the conflict. His transformation was complete. He was not merely aiding the Arab Revolt. He was part of it, bound to its fate and its consequences. These guerrilla tactics would not only shape the outcome of the Arab Revolt, but also influence future military strategies. The principles of mobility, psychological warfare, and sabotage would be studied and adopted by generations of insurgents and commanders alike. But for Lawrence, the war was far from over. The road ahead was filled with greater risks, deeper betrayals, and a battle not just for land, but for the very soul of the Arab dream. Part 5. Riding with rebels, earning trust in a foreign land. The desert was an unforgiving master, But for those who called it home, it was also a sanctuary. For Lawrence, winning battles was not enough. He needed to win the trust of the men who fought them. Without their acceptance, he would remain an outsider, a British officer with no true stake in the struggle. But trust was not freely given in the Arab world. It had to be earned through hardship, honor, and loyalty. By this stage, Lawrence had already impressed Arab leaders like Prince Faisal with his strategic brilliance, but that was not enough to gain the confidence of the Bedouin warriors, who risked their lives daily. Many viewed him with suspicion, uncertain if he truly believed in their cause, or if he was simply another foreigner playing politics in the desert. Tribal rivalries ran deep, and the unity of the Arab Revolt was fragile. Even among allies, tensions could ignite over ancient feuds, and without careful diplomacy, the entire movement could collapse. Lawrence quickly realized that military skill alone would not secure victory. He had to navigate these tribal dynamics and prove himself not just as a leader, but as one of them. To bridge this gap, Lawrence abandoned the trappings of his British identity and fully embraced the Bedouin way of life. He exchanged his military uniform for flowing Arab robes, not as a disguise, but as a declaration of his commitment. He learned their customs, spoke their language fluently, and adapted to their way of thinking. He did not demand special treatment as an outsider. He slept in the open desert, endured long marches without food or water, and shared in the hardships of the men he fought alongside. His willingness to suffer as they did earned him a grudging respect that slowly deepened into true trust. But true acceptance required more than endurance. It required action. A defining moment came when Lawrence personally intervened to save the life of an Arab fighter who had been wounded in battle. As the man lay bleeding under the scorching sun, his fellow warriors hesitated. Superstition and tradition dictated that the injured were often left behind. But Lawrence refused to accept this fate. Defying their expectations, he lifted the man onto his own camel and carried him across miles of brutal desert to safety. This act of selflessness shattered any lingering doubts about his loyalty. He was no longer just an observer, he was their brother in arms. Lawrence's transformation was so complete that even his enemies began to take notice. The Ottomans put a price on his head, recognizing that his influence over the Arabs had made him a far greater threat than any conventional British officer. Yet his growing attachment to the Arab cause also raised concerns among his own superiors. British officials questioned whether he had become too invested, too emotionally entangled in a war that was ultimately not his own. Some suspected that his loyalties had shifted away from Britain altogether, that he had become more Arab than English. The truth was far more complex. Lawrence believed in the Arab struggle, but he was haunted by the knowledge that Britain's promises of independence might never be honored. He was caught between two worlds, one that had given him purpose, and another that saw him as an unpredictable agent of chaos. As the war raged on, the bonds Lawrence had forged with his Arab comrades only deepened. He participated in their ceremonies, learned their traditions, and shared in their triumphs and losses. Yet, with every step he took deeper into their world, he felt the weight of deception pressing upon him. The British government had its own interests, and Lawrence knew that the grand promises made to the Arabs might never come to pass. But for now, the war was all that mattered. The fight continued, and Lawrence would ride beside his newfound brothers until the bitter end. Part 6: Victory and Vengeance, the Fall of Aqaba. Aqaba stood as a symbol of Ottoman control, an impenetrable fortress that blocked the Arab Revolt's path to the north. Guarded by well-armed garrisons and protected by the Red Sea, it seemed impervious to attack from the land. The British Royal Navy had considered an assault, but the heavily fortified coastal defenses made a seaborne invasion too costly. The Ottomans believed that the vast desert stretching behind Aqaba was its ultimate shield. No army could possibly cross it and survive. But they had not accounted for Lawrence. By mid-1917, the Arab Revolt had gained momentum, but its future depended on a decisive victory. Lawrence knew that seizing Aqaba would transform the war, securing a vital supply route for the Arabs and cutting deep into Ottoman defenses. Yet attacking the city head-on would be suicidal. Instead, he devised an audacious plan, one that would test the endurance, cunning, and will of his forces. He would lead a daring overland assault, striking from the very desert the Ottomans had dismissed as impassable. With only a few hundred Arab fighters, Lawrence embarked on one of the most grueling marches of the war. The journey through the Nefud Desert was brutal, weeks of scorching heat, scarce water, and constant threats from hostile tribes. Many believed the mission was doomed before it even began. But Lawrence pressed forward, relying on his growing alliances with local leaders to guide his men through the treacherous terrain. The warriors under his command were hardened by the desert, but even they had never undertaken such a perilous trek. Their survival hinged on trust in their leader, trust in their own resilience, and trust that victory lay beyond the endless dunes. After weeks of suffering, they finally emerged from the desert, positioning themselves behind Aqaba's unsuspecting defenders. The Ottoman forces had prepared for an attack from the sea, never imagining that death would come galloping from the barren wasteland. On July 6, 1917, the assault began. With ruthless efficiency, Arab fighters overwhelmed the garrisons, striking with the fury of men who had endured too much to fail. The battle was swift and merciless. The Ottoman troops, unprepared and demoralized, either surrendered or fled. By the end of the day, Aqaba belonged to the Arab Revolt. Victory, however, was not without bloodshed. As the city fell, a wave of vengeance swept through the Arab ranks. Years of oppression under Ottoman rule had fostered deep resentment, and now, with power in their hands, some sought retribution. Lawrence, horrified by the chaos, struggled to restrain his men. He had fought beside them, suffered beside them, and earned their respect, but at this moment, his influence was not enough to halt the tide of rage. The reality of war had stripped away any illusions he might have held about the purity of the cause. Even in triumph, brutality reigned. With Aqaba secured, Lawrence knew the next step was critical. The British High Command needed to recognize the importance of this victory, not just for military strategy, but for the Arab cause itself. With no means to send an immediate message, Lawrence took matters into his own hands. He rode nearly 200 miles across the Sinai Peninsula, enduring scorching heat and exhaustion, to personally deliver news of Aqaba's fall to British command in Cairo. His arrival, ragged and near collapse, was met with astonishment. He had done the impossible. Yet, even as he stood before British officials, triumph gave way to unease. Would London honor the promises made to the Arabs, or would this victory be used for imperial interests alone? Lawrence had won a battle, but he had also set events into motion that he could no longer control. The fate of the Arab Revolt, and his own conscience, hung in the balance. Part 7. The High Price of War, Betrayals, Losses and Doubts. Victory had come at Aqaba, but it had not brought peace. Instead, it had ushered in a new phase of the war, one filled with deeper complexities, shifting loyalties, and an increasing sense of unease. Lawrence had led his men to triumph, yet the euphoria of conquest faded quickly. He had seen the price of war, not just in blood, but in the moral compromises it demanded. The Arab Revolt was no longer just a fight for liberation. It was entangled in British imperial interests, and Lawrence could no longer ignore the looming specter of betrayal. In the months following Aqaba's capture, Lawrence became more entangled in the political machinations that surrounded the Arab cause. The British had promised independence to the Arabs, yet behind closed doors, they had already made other plans. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, a secret deal between Britain and France, had carved up the Middle East long before Lawrence had even set foot in the desert. The lands the Arabs fought for, the lands they had bled for, were nothing more than bargaining chips in the hands of European powers. Lawrence, who had built his life around uniting the Arab tribes, now found himself complicit in a deception he could not control. The strain of this knowledge weighed heavily on him. He had become a hero in the eyes of the Arab fighters, a trusted leader who had risked everything alongside them. Yet, he knew the truth would one day surface, that despite all their victories, despite the blood they had shed, the dream of true independence was slipping away. The realization gnawed at him, deepening the turmoil within. How could he continue to fight, knowing that the freedom he had promised might never come? The battlefield offered no reprieve from these doubts. As the Arab Revolt pressed further north, the war grew more savage. Ottoman reprisals against Arab villages were relentless, their forces massacring those suspected of aiding the rebellion. Lawrence witnessed firsthand the brutality inflicted upon those who had put their faith in him. The sight of burned-out settlements, of men, women, and children slaughtered without mercy, hardened something within him. He had once believed in fighting with honor, but war had no room for such ideals. In retaliation, Lawrence led increasingly brutal raids against Ottoman outposts, targeting supply lines, ambushing convoys, and showing no mercy to enemy forces. He had once convinced himself that he fought for a noble cause, but now he began to question whether he had become the very thing he once opposed. He carried out acts of war that haunted him. Villages were left in ruins, trains were derailed and looted, and prisoners were executed without hesitation. Each victory came with a deeper sense of loss, as if he were losing pieces of himself with every battle. Doubt crept into his mind like an unshakable shadow. Was he truly helping the Arabs, or was he merely a tool in Britain's imperial ambitions? The war had started with clear objectives, but now everything was blurred: his allegiance, his morality, even his sense of self. He had been raised in a world of scholarship and ideals, but war had reshaped him into something else entirely. As Lawrence continued to fight, he carried a growing burden, one that no medal, no victory, and no recognition could ease. He had given everything to the Arab cause, but in doing so, had lost his own sense of purpose. The man who had once ridden into battle with unwavering conviction, now rode with the weight of betrayal, loss, and an uncertain future pressing down upon him. The war was not over, but Lawrence was already beginning to understand that even in victory, defeat was never far behind. Part 8. The March to Damascus, a dream on the brink of collapse. The long march to Damascus had begun. After the triumphant capture of Aqaba, Lawrence and the Arab forces turned their eyes northward, seeking to strike the final blow against the Ottomans. The sands of the desert stretched endlessly before them, and each step forward carried the weight of both hope and uncertainty. Lawrence knew that the Arab forces had come far, defying expectations at every turn, but the final stretch of war was proving to be the most grueling. The closer they got to Damascus, the more the cracks in the grand vision of independence began to show. The British had supported the Arab Revolt as a means to weaken the Ottoman Empire, but as the war neared its end, Lawrence could no longer ignore the uneasy truth. The dream of a free Arab state, a cause he had promised his allies, was now caught in a web of imperial ambitions. The secret Sykes-Picot Agreement had already divided the Middle East between Britain and France, and despite all the blood that had been shed, the Arabs were unlikely to gain true control over the lands they had fought for. This knowledge burned within him, yet he could not reveal it. He had led these men into battle, convinced them to risk their lives, and now he carried the unbearable weight of knowing that their sacrifices might be in vain. Tensions between the British command and the Arab forces began to grow. The British saw Damascus as a strategic prize, while the Arabs saw it as the heart of their future kingdom. Lawrence found himself caught between these conflicting ambitions, a soldier sworn to Britain yet devoted to the Arab cause. His dual role as a military leader and political intermediary became an unbearable burden. He pleaded with British officers to recognize the Arab contributions to the war, but his words fell on deaf ears. To them, the Arabs were merely an auxiliary force, useful, but not equals. This realization deepened his frustration, as he saw the men he had fought alongside being dismissed by the very empire he served. Meanwhile, the march through the desert was taking its toll. The battles grew more brutal, the Ottoman defenses more desperate. The Arab forces suffered heavy losses, and the reality of war hardened them. The raids became more merciless, and Lawrence himself grew colder, his conscience battling against the necessity of violence. He had always tried to balance his ideals with the demands of war, but now survival dictated the rules. As he watched villages burn and soldiers fall, he wondered if the price of revolution was too high. Yet the closer they came to Damascus, the more fragile their unity became. Rivalries between Arab factions threatened to unravel the movement at its most crucial moment. Some tribal leaders began to question Lawrence's true motives. Was he really fighting for them, or was he just another agent of British interests? The man who had once been their trusted ally now found himself under scrutiny, and it pained him to see doubt in their eyes. He had given everything to their cause, but the shadow of British betrayal loomed too large to ignore. Exhausted and conflicted, Lawrence pushed forward. He had spent years in the desert, transforming from an Oxford scholar into a warrior, but now he questioned what it had all been for. If Damascus fell only to be placed under European rule, had the entire revolt been a lie? The journey was nearing its end, but the dream he had fought for was beginning to slip through his fingers. Damascus awaited, but so did the ultimate reckoning. Part 9. A city seized, a promise broken, the aftermath of war. Damascus had always been the dream. It was the heart of the Arab vision for independence, the city that would symbolize freedom after years of struggle. When the Arab forces, with Lawrence among them, finally entered its streets in triumph, it seemed as though the revolt had achieved its ultimate goal. But triumph quickly turned to disillusionment. The moment the city was seized, it became clear that this victory was only an illusion. The very independence Lawrence had promised was already being stripped away before their eyes. The initial euphoria of the Arab fighters was short-lived. Rival factions immediately laid competing claims to leadership, deepening the divisions that had always lurked beneath the surface. The practical difficulties of governance were overwhelming. There was no centralized administration, no infrastructure to sustain the city, and an already exhausted population wary of yet another ruler. Arab factions, once bound by a common enemy, now found themselves at odds. The chaos grew worse when the British and French, standing in the shadows, stepped forward to take control. Lawrence had known the truth for some time, but seeing it unfold was unbearable. The secret Sykes-Picot Agreement, which had divided the Middle East between European powers, was now being enforced. France laid claim to Syria, and the British, despite all their promises, made no effort to stop them. The Arab leaders, who had fought with unwavering faith, were suddenly treated as mere bystanders in the fate of their own lands. Their dream of self-rule had never been a reality, it had been a carefully managed deception. The betrayal ran deep. Faisal, the Arab leader Lawrence had supported, attempted to establish a government, but his authority was hollow. The British, pretending to be neutral, quietly allowed the French to advance. When the reality of foreign rule became undeniable, the Arab forces felt a bitter sense of humiliation. They had fought, bled, and died believing they were securing their future, only to see their victory handed over to European powers. For Lawrence, this was more than a political loss, it was a personal reckoning. He had persuaded these men to fight, convinced them that the British were their allies, and now he saw them being discarded, as if their sacrifices had meant nothing. He had believed in the cause, had even seen himself as part of it, but now he realized he had unknowingly played a role in their betrayal. The very people who had welcomed him, trusted him, and called him a brother were left with nothing but broken promises. The streets of Damascus, once filled with the energy of revolution, became a battleground of disillusionment. Arab fighters, once united, turned against each other in frustration. The British, feigning helplessness, allowed the city to descend into disorder, knowing that instability would only strengthen their position. Meanwhile, the French loomed on the horizon, ready to claim Syria as their own. It was no longer a question of if Damascus would fall under European control. It was only a matter of when. Lawrence could no longer bear it. The weight of what had happened, of what he had been complicit in, became too much. He had spent years in the desert, transforming from an idealistic scholar into a warrior, believing that he was part of something greater. But now, as he looked around at the city that was slipping from Arab hands, he saw only the wreckage of a cause that had been doomed from the start. He had once ridden into battle with the fire of revolution in his heart. Now he walked away, hollowed by the realization that the dream had never truly been theirs to win. Part 10. Shadows of Diplomacy. Lawrence at the Paris Peace Conference. The war had been fought on promises. Now, in the grand halls of the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, those promises were being broken. Lawrence arrived with hope, believing that his years in the desert, the battles fought, and the blood spilled had secured a future for the Arab people. But as he entered the ornate conference rooms filled with world leaders, he quickly realized that this was not a place for warriors. It was a battleground of diplomacy where power, not loyalty, determined the future. The contrast was staggering. The lavish chandeliers, polished marble floors, and the quiet murmur of negotiations were a world away from the vast, unforgiving desert where the Arab Revolt had taken shape. Here, men in tailored suits and gilded surroundings would decide the fate of lands they had never seen, and people they did not understand. Faisal, who had fought to unite the Arabs under the dream of independence, now stood before the same powers who had secretly divided his homeland long before the war had even ended. Lawrence had once been the architect of daring raids and military victories, but now he found himself in a different kind of battle, one where influence was measured not by courage, but by political leverage. The Arab delegation was met with cold diplomacy. Their appeals for self-rule were drowned out by European powers who had already decided their course. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, a betrayal Lawrence had known of but could never prevent, loomed over every discussion. France demanded Syria, Britain laid claim to Iraq and Palestine, and the Arabs were left with little more than empty reassurances. Torn between his loyalty to the Arab cause and his obligations to Britain, Lawrence found himself increasingly isolated. His former allies in the British government now saw him as a nuisance, a man too emotionally invested in a lost cause. He argued fiercely, pressing the case for Arab self-rule. But the room was filled with men who viewed the Middle East not as a land of people and culture, but as a map to be carved up for imperial control. Each time Faisal spoke of independence, he was met with vague responses and political maneuvering designed to pacify, rather than empower. The tension in the air was suffocating. Faisal, once confident in the promises made to him, began to see the reality unfolding. The dream of a free Arab state was slipping away, signed away on paper by men who had never set foot in the lands they now claimed. Lawrence, watching helplessly, felt his frustration turn to quiet rage. The men he had fought alongside, the people he had sworn to help, were being discarded with a few strokes of a pen. Behind closed doors, the final decisions were made. Syria was handed to France, the British secured their control over Palestine and Mesopotamia, and the Arabs were left with a kingdom that was little more than a symbolic gesture. Faisal had won a throne, but not the independence he had fought for. Lawrence had spent years in the desert believing in the cause, but now he saw that the true war had never been fought there. It had always been waged in places like this, where ideals were no match for power. As he left the conference, the weight of defeat settled heavily on his shoulders. The promises had been illusions, the victories meaningless in the face of imperial ambition. He had fought for a dream that was never meant to come true. For the first time, Lawrence truly understood that the world was not shaped by warriors, but by those who sat in the shadows of diplomacy. Part 11. Disillusionment and Withdrawal. The man who walked away. The war had ended, but for Lawrence there was no victory, only betrayal and regret. The dream he had fought for, the vision of an independent Arab world, had been crushed under the weight of imperial politics. At the Paris Peace Conference, the promises he had made on behalf of Britain were cast aside as Arab lands were divided between the British and the French. The people he had ridden beside, the men who had fought and died for their freedom, had been abandoned to colonial rule. For Lawrence, this was not just a diplomatic failure, it was a personal devastation. The weight of it pressed on him, deepening his disillusionment and leaving him to question his own role in the war. Had he been a liberator, or merely a tool in Britain's imperial game? The realization consumed him, and with it, his desire to remain in the public eye vanished. When King George V offered him a knighthood in 1918, Lawrence refused. The ceremony at Buckingham Palace was meant to honor his wartime achievements, but for Lawrence, it felt like a hollow gesture from a government that had betrayed the very people he had fought for. He walked out without a word, turning his back on the British establishment. It was the first of many rejections. He refused wealth, declined official positions, and resisted efforts to celebrate his legacy. The man once known as Lawrence of Arabia no longer wished to exist. Seeking anonymity, Lawrence made the radical decision to enlist in the Royal Air Force in 1922 under a false name, John Hume Ross. He abandoned the privileges of his past and willingly took on the life of an ordinary airman, performing menial duties in complete obscurity. But his escape was short-lived. The press soon uncovered his identity, and the scandal forced him out of the RAF. Undeterred, he attempted another disappearance, this time joining the Royal Tank Corps in 1923 under a different alias, T. Shaw. He lived in barracks, followed orders, and tried to blend into the ranks, but no disguise could erase his past. He remained a man burdened by history, forever pursued by the shadow of his former self. Despite his efforts to vanish, the weight of his experiences continued to haunt him. The war had not only taken a toll on his body, but had left deep scars on his mind. He suffered from depression, recurring nightmares, and a profound sense of guilt. He had won great victories, but at what cost? His devotion to the Arab cause had left him feeling betrayed and empty, and no matter how far he withdrew from public life, he could not escape his own memories. In an attempt to make sense of his past, he turned to writing. Lawrence spent years revising 7 Pillars of Wisdom, a book that was part war memoir, part philosophical reflection, and part confession. It was not just a record of his experiences in the Arab Revolt, but a deeply personal exploration of leadership, sacrifice, and the pain of disillusionment. In its pages, he bared his soul, wrestling with the consequences of his actions and the betrayal he felt, not only by his government but by himself. He privately published an expensive edition of the book in 1926, followed by a more accessible version in 1935, hoping that by telling his story, he might finally find some peace. But the ghosts of war never left him. As the years passed, Lawrence became increasingly reclusive. He abandoned politics entirely, retreating into solitude and seeking solace in speed. Motorcycles became his escape, and he would ride them at reckless speeds, pushing himself to the limit as if trying to outrun the past. He found comfort in the precision of machines, in the controlled chaos of motion, but even this thrill could not silence the doubts that plagued him. The war had made him a legend, but he had come to despise that very legend. He had once been at the center of history, shaping the fate of nations. Now he was a man trying desperately to disappear. He had walked away from everything, but he would never be free of what he had left behind. Part 12, A New Identity, Lawrence's Strange Life After War. The man once known as Lawrence of Arabia had vanished. T. Lawrence, the famed strategist and war hero, rejected his past, his titles, and the fame that followed him like a shadow. He wanted obscurity, not recognition. He cast off his identity and took a new name, T. Shaw, a symbolic break from the world that had once hailed him as a hero. Yet no matter how much he tried to disappear, the weight of his past was impossible to escape. Determined to leave behind the burden of his wartime legacy, Lawrence sought refuge in military service. But this time, he was not a leader of men, nor a warrior fighting for a cause. Instead, he enlisted as a simple soldier, using false names to slip into anonymity. His first attempt came in 1922, when he joined the Royal Air Force under the name John Hume Ross. But fame refused to loosen its grip on him. When the press uncovered his true identity, he was discharged, forcing him to find another path. He then joined the Royal Tank Corps as T. Shaw, a name he would legally adopt. Yet even there, recognition followed. His presence stirred curiosity, and again, he was forced to leave. Beyond the military, Lawrence struggled to adjust to civilian life. Without a war to fight, without a cause to serve, he felt displaced. He withdrew into rural isolation, retreating to a small cottage, Clouds Hill, in Dorset. Here, he lived a quiet and simple life, dedicating himself to writing and mechanical work. Yet the solitude did little to silence the ghosts of his past. The memories of war, betrayal, and lost comrades lingered. He found solace in his books, in letters to close friends like George Bernard Shaw, and in the roar of his motorcycles. Speed became his new obsession. If he could not outrun his past, he could at least outrun his thoughts. He purchased a series of powerful Brough Superior motorcycles, the fastest machines of their time, and rode them recklessly across the countryside. The thrill of speed was an escape, a momentary release from the weight he carried. He often tested the limits of his machines, pushing them faster, riding longer, as if trying to outrun the memories that refused to fade. Yet, despite his retreat from public life, his legend only grew. Admirers still sought him out. Journalists continued to write about him. Even as global tensions began rising toward another war, his name remained relevant. But Lawrence wanted nothing to do with politics. He refused all involvement, turning down offers that would have brought him back into the spotlight. His war was over, but the world had not forgotten. In his final years, he focused on writing, revising 7 Pillars of Wisdom, and working on the Mint, an account of his RAF experiences. His words, filled with the weight of his past, were his way of making peace with the life he had lived. But peace was fleeting. No matter how far he withdrew, the echoes of Lawrence of Arabia never truly faded. The man who had once reshaped the Middle East now lived in self-imposed exile. He had given up his titles, abandoned his fame, and walked away from the world. But the world never truly let him go. Part 13, Speed, Secrets and Shadows, The Final Years. The legend of Lawrence of Arabia did not fade after the war. It merely shifted into something more enigmatic. As T. Lawrence withdrew from public life, he sought refuge in speed, secrecy and solitude, living in the shadows of his own fame. The man who had once commanded armies in the desert now found himself restless, haunted by the past and uncertain of the future. Lawrence's obsession with speed became one of his defining traits in his final years. He developed an intense fascination with motorcycles, particularly the Brough Superior, which he described as the best thing ever built. He rode recklessly, pushing the limits of both machine and man, as though chasing an escape from the ghosts of his past. He found solace in the rush of wind against his face, the sensation of speed offering a fleeting sense of control in a world that had long ceased making sense to him. But even as he embraced speed, he could not outrun the burdens of his own mind. His retreat at Clouds Hill in Dorset became a sanctuary, where he could distance himself from the world. The modest cottage, devoid of modern comforts, reflected his desire for simplicity and isolation. There, he immersed himself in literature, writing and maintaining his motorcycles. Yet despite his withdrawal from public life, Lawrence remained in contact with high-ranking officials and intelligence operatives. Though officially retired, he was rumored to have undertaken covert assignments for British intelligence, feeding into the enduring mystery that surrounded his name. Some believe his correspondence with key figures hinted at Britain's quiet preparations for the looming Second World War. His mind, still sharp and analytical, remained valuable to those in power, even as he attempted to fade into obscurity. Yet solitude could not silence the weight of his memories. Lawrence struggled privately with the psychological toll of war, betrayal, and the burden of his own legend. His letters reveal a man deeply tormented by regret and purposelessness. He had fought for an ideal, only to see it dismantled by politics. The war had ended, but the battles within him raged on. He lived like a man caught between two worlds, one in which he was a hero, and another where he wished to disappear entirely. On May 13, 1935, Lawrence set out on what would become his final ride. As he sped down a narrow road near his home, he swerved suddenly to avoid two young cyclists. In an instant he lost control, was thrown from his motorcycle, and struck the ground with devastating force. He was found unconscious and never regained awareness. After 6 days in a coma, he succumbed to his injuries, bringing an abrupt end to a life defined by contradictions. Yet even in death, mystery clung to his name. Some questioned whether his accident was truly an accident. Given his rumored intelligence connections, theories emerged suggesting he had been deliberately silenced. Had he known too much? Had his ties to Britain's military secrets made him a target? Though no definitive evidence supports these claims, the speculation only deepened the legend of T. Lawrence. Speed, secrets, and shadows marked his final years. He had lived a life of extremes: war and peace, fame and obscurity, purpose and disillusionment. But in the end, Lawrence of Arabia remained an enigma, a man forever straddling the line between myth and reality. Part 14, A Mysterious End, The Unresolved Death of Lawrence. On the morning of May 13, 1935, T. Lawrence set out on his powerful Brough Superior SS-100 motorcycle, speeding along the narrow country roads of Dorset. He had spent years in self-imposed obscurity, seeking refuge from fame and the ghosts of his past. But fate had other plans. As he rode through the quiet lanes near his home, an unexpected obstacle appeared. Two young cyclists suddenly emerged in his path. Swerving sharply to avoid them, Lawrence lost control and was thrown from his bike. His body hit the ground with devastating force, his head striking the hard road. He never regained consciousness. He was rushed to Bovington Camp Military Hospital, where he remained in a coma for 6 days. Despite the best efforts of medical experts, Lawrence succumbed to his injuries on May 19, 1935. The official cause of death was listed as severe head trauma. The accident seemed straightforward, yet it would quickly become shrouded in mystery. Suspicion swirled almost immediately. Some witnesses claimed they had seen a black car following Lawrence shortly before the crash, only for it to vanish without a trace. Others insisted that the scene of the accident had an unnatural silence, as if something had been staged. Lawrence had long been suspected of having connections to British intelligence, particularly in the years leading up to World War II. His deep knowledge of Middle Eastern affairs and secret military operations made him a valuable asset, or a dangerous liability. Could it be that his death was no accident? Adding to the intrigue, some theorized that Lawrence had been preparing for a secret mission. Just days before his accident, he had been in touch with high-ranking officials, including Winston Churchill. He had also written letters hinting at a new unnamed endeavor, though he never revealed what it was. The timing of his death, combined with his cryptic final days, only deepened the enigma. Yet, others believe his demise was simply a tragic accident, an unfortunate end for a man who had always pushed himself to the limits. The doctor who treated Lawrence, Hugh Cairns, was so affected by his injuries that he began extensive research into motorcycle safety. His work eventually led to the development and widespread use of protective helmets, saving countless lives in the years to come. In this way, even in death, Lawrence shaped the future. His funeral was a spectacle of national significance. Attended by military officials, government leaders, and close confidants, the service seemed almost too grand for a man who had spent his later years avoiding the limelight. Churchill himself paid tribute, mourning not just the loss of a soldier and adventurer, but of a man whose mind and spirit had left an indelible mark on history. Whether his death was an accident or something more sinister, one thing remains certain. Lawrence was never meant for an ordinary life, nor an ordinary end. The mystery surrounding his final moments has only strengthened his legend, ensuring that his name, like the desert winds he once rode, will never fade into silence. Part 15, Legend or Truth? The lasting legacy of Lawrence of Arabia. The name Lawrence of Arabia echoes through time, a figure of both admiration and mystery. His exploits in the desert became the stuff of legend, immortalized in literature, military strategy, and cinema. But as with all legends, the question remains: how much of it was truth, and how much was carefully crafted myth? Lawrence himself contributed to this enigma. His book, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, presented an intricate, vivid account of the Arab Revolt, filled with personal struggles, grand victories, and bitter losses. However, historians have long debated the accuracy of his claims. Did he exaggerate his role? Did he downplay the contributions of the Arab leaders who fought alongside him? Some argue that his account was more artistic than factual, shaped by his own perception rather than objective reality. One of the most enduring debates surrounding Lawrence is his true allegiance. To some, he was a passionate supporter of Arab independence, a man who risked everything to unite the tribes against the Ottomans. To others, he was first and foremost a British officer, bound by duty to the empire. His role in shaping the Arab Revolt was undeniable, but the outcome was not what he had hoped. The betrayal of the Arab cause through the Sykes-Picot Agreement haunted him, leaving him deeply disillusioned. Despite this disillusionment, Lawrence's influence stretched far beyond the battlefield. His guerrilla warfare tactics, utilizing mobility, deception, and psychological strategy, were revolutionary at the time and are still studied in military academies today. His understanding of the land, culture, and people gave him a tactical edge that proved decisive in multiple campaigns. Military historians regard his unconventional approach as a precursor to modern special operations warfare. Culturally, his impact is just as profound. The release of David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia in 1962 cemented his image as a lone, brooding hero caught between two worlds. While the film took creative liberties, it introduced his story to a global audience, ensuring his legacy would endure. His influence can also be found in literature, where his writings continue to inspire new generations of historians and adventurers. The mystique surrounding his character, scholar, warrior, recluse, adds to the ongoing fascination with his life. Yet separating fact from fiction remains a challenge. Was he a master of self-promotion, carefully constructing his own myth? Or was he a reluctant hero, burdened by the weight of his own experiences? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Even in death, Lawrence remains elusive, his story shifting depending on the perspective of those who tell it. His legacy is one of brilliance and contradiction, a man who reshaped history, but could never quite escape it. More than a century later, his story still captivates. Whether viewed as a visionary, a warrior, or a tragic figure, Lawrence's legacy is undeniable. The desert winds may have long since buried the tracks of his journey, but the echoes of his name still resonate across time. Forever a legend, forever a mystery. Thanks for tuning in to Historical Legacies. If you enjoyed this dive into history, please like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for more fascinating stories from the past.